Here's another way that economic democracy undercuts political democracy. Our jobs, this is a topic I talk about a lot, our jobs are not organized in a democratic way. When you go to work in the morning, whether it's an office, a store, or a factory, you walk into a place where a tiny group of people, the board of directors, that's usually about 15 people in a corporation, who are elected or selected by the major shareholders. Once again, just to remind you, the board of directors, which makes all the basic decisions for every company that matters. 15 people. How do you get to be on the board of directors? You get elected. Elected by whom? By the shareholders. The shareholders get one vote per share they own. So if you own no shares, that's how many votes you have to decide who runs a company. You have no votes. If you have 12 shares, you get 12 votes. If you have 212 million shares, you get 212 million votes. 1% of this country owns 2/3 of the shares. That's the 1% who controls who gets on the board of directors. You have 11 shares of General Motors left to you by your great-grandmother when she died. And I'm happy for you. But your influence over General Motors is the equivalent of mine, and my grandmother had no shares for anybody. Okay? Tiny group of people decide who's on the board of directors. That's why I want to tell all of you that are considering a career of making it to the board of directors, buy lottery tickets. Your odds are better. Right? Okay? Now, that means when you go to work, you enter a fundamentally undemocratic place. You do what you're told. You arrive 9 o'clock. Why? Because that's what you were told. And you sit over there. Why? Because that's what you were told. And you work with this machine because that's what you were told. With this piece of paper because that's what you were told. With this job in mind, with that's what you were told. And at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, you were told, go home, leave whatever you produced here. You may have poured your brain into it and your muscles and your creativity, but it's not yours. You did it. You don't get it. Go home. And back tomorrow and do it all again. You schmuck. But we leave that out because we don't want to hurt your feelings. We want you to come back and do it again tomorrow. Okay? You have no power at all. Who decides if the factory you're working in or the office closes? The board of directors. You live with the consequences, which is you don't have a job. You don't have a place to go. What is your power? If you don't have shares, which the vast majority of workers do not have in the companies where they work, then you have no power at all. You live with the consequences, but you have no power. If they decide to use a technology that's very loud and messes up your ears, you're free, which means you can quit and go to another place to work. That same lack of democracy will exist. You have your choice of undemocratic workplaces. That's it. That's why it's so important to feel that you are free. Yeah, sure you're free. Right? So that's a fundamental undemocratic system. And now why is it undercutting political democracy? Because at work, office, factory, or store, that's where most people spend most of their adult lives. What are you talking about? As soon as you're finished with your education, you go to work. Monday to Friday, 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, you're in a fundamentally undemocratic place. And it's driven home to you every day in countless ways. What kind of a democratic political system can exist like this? My view is none. What you're doing is you're actually training people to have no belief in democracy, to have no expectation of democracy. Because that's what you're doing every day. Of course, when you go home to work, you don't, from work, and you're in your community, your home, your neighborhood, do you think about, let's see, what would be good for our neighborhood? How should we, you don't think like that. Those are not your questions. Those are the questions for the people who run the business. They're the ones who think about what should happen. You just come and do your job and then go home. And go home and get a beer and sit down in front of the TV and shove 2 big pieces of pizza into your face and then go to sleep so you have the energy to do all this fun again in the morning. There's no training for democracy in the community. Of course people aren't democratically motivated. They don't know the first thing about how to run a community because they're never allowed to run the place where they do their work. If we had worker co-ops, if we had an organization of business that was democratically run so that every worker had the responsibility, not just the right, but the responsibility to make all the big decisions. If the board of directors was the whole collection of workers. So you work Monday to Thursday, but Friday when you come to work, you don't do your normal job. You sit around with all the other workers and you decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Because that's what a human being should do. If you did that on the job, you'd be training people for the kind of participatory management that you ask of them in the democratic society. The New York Times wouldn't have to wonder why people don't care about voting, because they're not involved in making any decisions about how the world works. They're fundamentally excluded from it most of the time in most of their adult lives. But they should suddenly flip out and be completely other in the community with political things than they are demanded to be 5 out of 7 days a week on the job. Makes no sense. And any society that wanted politics to be democratic in more than the formalities of it all, the rituals, if you really cared, you would have had long ago to have a debate on the fundamental question, how in the world could we have a political democracy if we sit it on top of an economic system that is so anti-democratic as we've arranged it? There's no way out of this. It's also a question of taste. You know, people who become, I'll tell you in a personal way, people who become heads of big corporations tend to go to certain schools in this country. It sort of reproduces itself. Some of you know them, Andover and Exeter. I don't know if many of you know what those words mean, but those are famous private schools. And those schools are set up for people who know that they want to be the folks who run the businesses, and they know it because they come from the families that already do, more or less. Every now and then, and they get trained, they go then to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and all that. And periodically, these schools make a mistake. They accept into their ranks the people who didn't come from where they're supposed to. They often do this with an enormous amount of patting themselves on the back for their enormously liberal approach of having others come in. You know, the diversity gambit or something else. So, turns out in my life that even though my folks had nothing, I went to Harvard. And when I finished, I went to Stanford. And when I finished there, I went to Yale. Jeez. 10 years of my life in these strange institutions. They were strange for me because I knew real early on, in that deep way one does, that I didn't belong there. But they didn't figure it out, and I wasn't going to tell them. So I stayed there. And I learned something very interesting. That the few like me, we worked very hard for the first 2 years as undergraduates, because that's what we had been told. My parents told me, you know, your only hope is to do well in school and get good grades, and that's how you'll not be stuck in the dead-end kind of jobs we got. So I was really pressured. Get out of here. So I worked real hard the first 2 years. It took me 2 years to notice that most of the other guys didn't do that. Starting early Thursday, they began to drink. And they kept drinking right through Sunday. And I admired that. I admired that because I didn't do that. And they weren't worried about it. I would have worried myself. I'm not studying. I mean, unthinkable to do that. But they didn't worry about it. because their jobs were, and they kind of had a certain gentlemanly style. I admired it. It wasn't just that they had those tweed coats with the leather patch on the elbow, even though the leather patch was put on a portion of the tweed that hadn't begun to wear out, not even a little bit. It was a leather patch put there because it was a leather patch, but not because anybody needed it. I didn't have this problem because I had no tweed coat. And I would have gotten a leather patch if I'd had a tweed coat, but I didn't have one. And I worried about it, but they didn't. And I realized after a while that they didn't because they had the taste, the kind of the upbringing. They knew they were going to work in the company somewhere. You know, it might not be exactly where they would want, but that. You know, they knew. The mass of workers also learned something, which I could see. The mass of people realize pretty early, even if they don't admit it to themselves, that they're not going there. Now, some get it sooner, some take a longer time. We all know that. It's hard to face that for some people. They really want to believe that there's some sort of meritocracy, that if you work hard or if you're smart, you're going to get there. And I have it in my classes all the time, I hate to explain to my students that this is silly. It's too hurtful. I mean it. It's too hurt. It's too painful. They want to hold on to that hope, and there's something beautiful about trying to hold on, even there's something pathetic at the same time, since it's such a crazy idea. And I learned that these wealthy kids, these well-prepared children, they were going to be good at running a business, because it really has nothing to do with skill. It has to do with a sense. You have to understand, running a business is a little like certain kinds of people go into a fancy store on Fifth Avenue. You know, you can go in that store, but you kind of know. You think people are looking at you. You think the floor manager may have his eye on you. You better not even think about what you might want to do there. Whereas there's another person comes through the door who acts like he or she has been there all her life, for whom everybody else is a servant. And she's going to pick which one of you is going to be lucky enough to take care of me. And she's charming, or he's charming, doesn't matter. They know they belong there. Well, you know, political democracy is like that. You either feel that you're in charge here. You have your say. You have to be listened to. And the majority opinion has to be taken seriously. Some people feel that. But the irony in our society is that the people at the top feel it, and we don't need that. We need it for everybody else, but they can't feel it because they're never put in a situation where that is encouraged, supported, sustained, none of it. And that's because of the job. On the job, you are, I hate to tell you this, because you don't want to hear it. You're a drone. You're that kind of bee, you know, that does the same thing until the lizard gets you. You know, that's it. You know, that's it. If you want a political democracy, you have to have an economic democracy. You have to transform the enterprise where people work. It has to be a completely different place. Otherwise, your commitment to political democracy is as phony as a $4 bill. It doesn't work. It never has. It never, ever has. I defy you to find me a place which could sustain, historically, could sustain anything approaching a political democracy on the basis of the absence of democracy in its economic system.